You have made it to another Monday night, and that means a new episode of Military Images Live. I'm Ron Coddington. I am the editor and publisher of Military Images magazine, and bringing to you our program, which comes live to you from our offices in Arlington, Virginia. We're also available on YouTube, our YouTube channel. You can check us out there. We will archive the show when it is done. So we're going to wait a moment for folks to come online and join the show, and then we'll get underway with the program, with tonight's program. So Rick Wolf is here. Welcome, Rick. And while others are coming aboard, I will mention Mike Werner is here. Hey, Mike. While others are coming aboard, I'm going to read to you a couple pieces of mail that I received over the last couple weeks. Hey, Gilbert Rain is here. A couple pieces of mail I want to read to you. One of them comes from Brian Zeller. And Brian is a new subscriber to the magazine. I really appreciate him. He found an ad online and signed up for a trial subscription, which gives him a free copy of the magazine to look at and review. And he didn't write a lot, a big thank you, which was very nice. But here he wrote something that I wanted to mention. He said, "My family enjoyed the magazine." I thought that was terrific. It wasn't just Brian, but it was his family that got joy out of the magazine. So a tip of the cap to Brian for that nice note. Other folks are now coming on, and I really appreciate that. Dan, Liz Topping, Kyle, John, Dave, Joe, Rich, Bobby, lots of folks coming on. So thanks so much for being here. The other note that I want to read comes from Debbie Graham in Hayesville, North Carolina. Here's Debbie's note, and she said something that really touched me. At the end of her note, she says, "Thank you also for your stand in trying to bring folks together in trying times." Now, as I told Debbie, it's not really me that's bringing folks together. It's really the stories of the soldiers and the sailors through the magazine that's making that happen. So a big thank you to Debbie for noticing that. It makes me feel really good to know that Military Images can touch subscribers like Debbie, whose husband, Chris, according to Debbie, loves MI, and of course, Brian Zeller. So a lot of good news there, and a big thanks to them. Now, with good news, sometimes we have not so good news. And tonight I want to share with you that Civil War Photo Collectors Society is ceasing as an organization. It was founded last year. Pardon me. It was founded last summer as a membership organization to bring together Civil War photo collectors. Well, the long and short of it is that the organization didn't really pick up a lot of members, and I think a combination of a number of events made it such that the organization wasn't really able to catch on. It wasn't able to therefore survive. So Doug York of Civil War Faces and I have decided to stop the organization. And however, I want you to know that in no way does the end of this organization reflect any negative values on the Civil War collecting community. I know through the magazine, through social media, that the Civil War collecting hobby, photo collecting hobby, is just going gangbusters. All of you are just a fantastic group, and I love being associated with you. So we will go onward. I'm happy that we tried the Civil War Photo Collectors Society. It wasn't meant to be, but we're going to carry on. One way we're carrying on at Military Images, and I'm going to take you back to the 1980s when the magazine was first launched. And we had a feature called Sutler's Row. You can see this is an original page or a copy of one of the original pages, the sepia tone page with Sutler's Row up top, everybody who was subscribing had the opportunity to put in a want ad or to sell things. So this kept up for years and years and years. When I became editor and publisher, we did a new version of the Sutler's Row, same idea, a new formula. A couple of years ago, discontinued it so we could make room for more advertising. And now I'm pleased to introduce and announce the next step of Sutler's Row, which is we're bringing it online onto Facebook. So if you go to Military Images Sutler's Row, you can join the group. Now, the purpose of the group is to take all the advertisers that we have in the magazine, some of the greatest advertisers, some of the greatest dealers in the hobby. Mike Medhurst, the Excelsior Brigade, Perry Frone, the list goes on and on and on. Jeff McCardle, Carrie Dellery, Steve Meadow. I could just list everybody. It goes on and on and on. Those guys are going to be profiled in Military Images Sutler's Row. We're going to do a couple posts a day and get some of their images out there. We invite them to post. We invite you guys to post too. Tell us what you're looking for. And if you want to sell something, you can sell on there as well. So Military Images Sutler's Row, facebook.com/Military Images Sutler's Row. Sign up. It just started yesterday, so you can get in the front door. Now, we've got a story tonight, and then we're going to do our research rabbit hole. So our story tonight has the title 1886 Decoration Day. Now, it starts with this man. It's a man you all know, the man who is perhaps one of the best known generals, not because of his military performance, but because of the sideburns. Of course, it's Ambrose Everett Burnside. Now, he's an important player in the individual that I'm going to talk about. And the individual appears in this book, The Life and Public Services of Ambrose E. Burnside by Benjamin Perley Moore. Now, if you look at the fine print, you'll see that there's an introduction by Henry B. Anthony. And at first I thought, is this the Henry Anthony of Civil War photo fame? Well, no, he's actually a senator from Rhode Island, distinguished, but not as a photographer. Anyway, I digress. Ambrose Burnside is where we begin tonight's story. Now, Ambrose Burnside had a servant, and that servant's name was Robert Holloway. And you're going to see a reference down here. It's on page 70 of the volume, where you see the very first reference to Robert Holloway. And as the story goes, they met in 1850 out in New Mexico territory. How Holloway, a slave from Virginia, obviously escaped, got to New Mexico, is not a story that I've been able to uncover. But we do know that the two men met there. And about that time, around 1850, Holloway became attached to then Lieutenant Burnside and followed him all the way back across the country to Rhode Island. Followed him, in fact, right into the Civil War. As many of you know, as you Civil War students know, Burnside and his Rhode Islanders were at the First Battle of Bull Run. And on that July day in 1861, when they were routed by Confederates and skedaddled all the way back to Washington, Burnside showed up in the town without Holloway. It seems that for the first time since 1850, when they met, the two men were separated. Well, it turns out that Holloway was captured during the First Battle of Bull Run. And I use the term captured with maybe an asterisk because he was not a combatant. He was a servant. He was a participant in the military, but he was not a soldier. This was 1861, and men of color were not going to be allowed to join the military for a while yet. Now, if you continue to read on in Burnside's book, if you go to page 136, you're going to find another reference. Also on page 137, you're going to find a reference to the capture, his internment in Richmond, his working in the Union prison there. And you're going to find out that Burnside tried to get Holloway back without success. If you look around hard enough, if you happen to be digging into the Rhode Island archives, you're going to find a photograph. And I believe it might be the only known photograph of Holloway. It's actually a carte de visite. And someone at some point in time typed in Burnside's servant buried at Bristol. This is Robert Holloway, servant, prisoner of war at the First Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. We're looking at, 159 years ago this month. Now, what happens with Burnside is, after those of you know his story, he leads an expedition down to the coast of North Carolina. He has some success, forces the surrender of a garrison along the coast, captures a bunch of Confederates, or accepts the surrender of a bunch of Confederates. 4 of those men are top-ranking officers. They are Henry M. Shaw of the 8th North Carolina, it's a colonel, another colonel, John V. Jordan of the 31st North Carolina, Lieutenant Colonel Wharton Green of the 2nd North Carolina Infantry Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel Frank P. Anderson of the 59th Virginia. All of these men had slaves. Burnside negotiated with them to do a trade. He traded their 4 slaves to get back Holloway. In March of 1862, Holloway was released unharmed and rejoined Burnside in North Carolina. By all accounts, the 2 men remained together through the rest of the war, after the war. Interestingly, in this biography written by Moore, Holloway, who was with Burnside for 30 years, 3 decades, is mentioned twice. 2 mentions in a book of hundreds of pages. Imagine what his life was like. The story we don't know about Holloway's escape to New Mexico. How did he get there? What did he do for Burnside along the way? There's a 1,200-mile trek through some hostile territory on the way back to Rhode Island. Lots of other stories about Burnside. Holloway participated in all of that. Was Holloway the guy that Burnside came home to in his tent and campaign, and Holloway helped him get ready for the next day? Holloway at Fredericksburg and elsewhere. Robert Holloway. Now, Holloway, he didn't get his due in Burnside's book, but I want to take you 20 years after the war. Holloway dies in 1877. His son, Robbie, continues to take care of Burnside until the general's death 4 years later in 1881. 5 years later, 5 years after that, in 1886, Decoration Day, veterans in Bristol, Rhode Island, you may recall, that's where he's buried, where Robert is buried. The veterans get together They're all members of the GAR post, and they commemorate Decoration Day. It's a somber event. They have a procession to town hall, have music, some speech making. One of the highlights of Decoration Day 1886 in Bristol, Rhode Island, is a reading of the Roll of Honor. They read the names that day of 125 men who are no longer in the ranks. 125 men who were present for the Union, for the war. 125 men. They read the names aloud that day in 1886. Among the names they read was Ambrose Burnside and Robert Holloway. He was not forgotten. And remember him today. Robert Holloway. All right. Now, let's take a little trip down the research rabbit hole. Tonight, we're going to talk about this man. If you know your uniforms, right away you're going to notice got some dark buttons up here. There's no brass buttons. Got a Union officer's waist belt plate. Got a sword. Got a nice tailored uniform. This, of course, is the uniform of a chaplain as prescribed in 1861 by Winfield Scott, was in charge at the time. Old Fuss and Feathers himself was behind a very simple uniform for chaplains. The belief was the chaplains didn't need a shiny, sparkly uniform. These are the men of God. They didn't need the brass and the braid. That was reserved for guys like Winfield Scott. Not that he wasn't a godlike man. You get the idea. Now, Henry Moore, his story is tied, his fate, in fact, is tied to this man, Benjamin Butler. Now, the collector who owns the photograph of Moore is Paul Lone. Now, Paul, when I was over at his place visiting a while back before the pandemic, told me the basic story about Benjamin Butler and Henry Moore. And all this goes down in the Atlantic Ocean, heading down the coast in a transport in Mississippi in early 1862. The transport winds up getting stranded on a shoal, and a gunboat along the blockade, the Mount Vernon, is going to come in and lighten the load. You got like something like 1,500 soldiers, including Butler, his wife, his staff, and Chaplain Moore, and the rest of his soul, all the souls that he took care of, and the 13th Maine Infantry. So all these men, 1,500 men, are on the Mississippi. And the idea here is let's get some of these men off of the Mississippi, which is grounded, and we'll lighten the load. The Mount Vernon will take these men away. We'll get the Mississippi off of the shoal, send it on its way, put the soldiers back on board. Simple plan. You'll find out what happens next. It does work. So if you go to Butler's book, here's the fate of Henry Moore. Inside, we get to find out in Butler's own words that he was hesitant to leave Mrs. Butler, but of course he knows that he can't leave his wife on board a possibly sinking ship in the Atlantic Ocean. So he sends Mrs. Butler on board the Mount Vernon. They're going to row her over in a boat. And here's where it gets interesting. Here's where we get to meet Reverend Moore. Butler says, an officer came and spoke to me. He was the chaplain of a Maine regiment. I will not give his name, though I ought to. General, said he, if you desire, I will accompany Mrs. Butler on board the Mount Vernon. Now, this is Chaplain Moore speaking. Butler says, oh, no, Chaplain. You need not trouble yourself to do that. Captain Glisson, this is the captain of the Mount Vernon, he's a gentleman. He's going to take care of it. Don't you worry about it. Moore makes something of a fatal mistake, the first fatal mistake, when he says, General, I prefer to go. Now, Butler is a little, he's irritated instantly. Well, he's more than irritated. Butler says, the devil you do. Look here, Chaplain. The government has trusted the bodies of 1,500 of its soldiers to my care and their souls to your care. And if your prayers are going to be of any use, it will be about now, as it looks to me. You cannot go, sir. Butler turns away. That's his side of the story. So, Butler goes over to the Mount Vernon. After a while, he actually inspects the ship. After the men are off, he plays the general, right? He's there. He eventually goes over to the Mount Vernon. And as he's being rowed over on a small boat, he goes up to the quarterdeck. And who does he see? He sees Reverend Moore on the quarterdeck of the Mount Vernon. Now, he's been told, he's been warned not to go. Now, chunky, portly Butler basically scrambles up on the quarterdeck, and he is upset. He approaches the chaplain and says, how came you here? Moore says, I came over last night. In what? Butler says. With Captain Glisson. What? In the last boat with Mrs. Butler? Yes, General, says Moore. After I ordered you not to? Yes, sir. Butler says, go below at once and write your resignation. I will accept it, and don't let me ever hear of you trying to get into the army again. Go. He also makes a comment. He says, whom should I see? This is how he starts it. Whom should I see on the deck but my chaplain of the long flowing curls and the Byronic collar? It's almost like he saw this photo. After all those years, he has a distinct memory of the flowing locks and the Byronic collar of Moore. Brutal. Now, this is in Butler's book. This is 1898. And you got to think, this guy's career, his life, is more or less ruined, and now it's public knowledge. I wanted to find out a little bit more, because you can't just say this one side of the story. And now, those of you who know Butler, you know what he's like. He's quite a guy. I won't go into detail. We could do several shows just about him. But here you have Butler all over this guy, ruining the man's career. He was a chaplain for all of 6 weeks, as it turns out. Now, the history of the 13th Maine, interestingly, comes out that same year, 1898. And guess what? Barely a mention of Reverend Moore, and the biggest mention of him is damning. It's written by a private. And here's what he says. Next morning, after a survey of the injured vessel, he's talking about Butler doing the inspection of the Mississippi before he goes to the Mount Vernon. He says, all had been transferred to the Mount Vernon. This is a reference to all the soldiers that were taken off so they could move the Mississippi off the sandbar. Except, all were returned to the Mississippi except one staff officer of the 13th, who, although like a guidepost pointing the way to heaven, and had apparently no personal desire to go there by water. He's talking about the chaplain. He therefore remained on the uninjured vessel and sent in his resignation, which was promptly accepted by General Butler. So here we have the regimental history of the 13th standing with Butler in condemnation of Reverend Moore. Now, I wasn't completely satisfied. I'm thinking, tell me more about, can I find anything more? I got a break when I began to look up the colonel of the 13th. Who knows the colonel of the 13th Maine? He's Neil Dow, temperance leader, reformist. Here he is in his brigadier's uniform. He was colonel of the 13th. And many years after the war, and this is crazy, also in 1898, Butler's book in 1898, the 13th Maine History in 1898. And here we have the reminiscences of Neil Dow. Neil Dow and Reverend Moore were pals. They were buds. They were bros. Neil Dow, it looks like, sort of invited, or at least encouraged, Reverend Moore to become the chaplain. Now, in his 80 years, Neil Dow is reminiscing on his services, including his military service with the 13th and other places during the war. And in his big book, he makes a mention of Moore. He says, he's talking about sending the men from the Mississippi, might break up, might sink, we don't know, over to the Mount Vernon. And he says, I directed Major Heseltine to proceed to the Mount Vernon. So he sends his major over. And then he says, I also sent our chaplain there to be out of harm's way. So there you have it. In that one sentence written by Neil Dow, there's something of an exoneration in all that. It also puts Reverend Moore in kind of an odd position. Should he obey Neil Dow, his commanding colonel, or should he obey Benjamin Butler? Well, considering the moment, the ship, all the chaos and confusion going on, you got to think that Neil Dow, Colonel Dow, and Butler, General Butler, they didn't take a moment to exchange views on the matter. Neil Dow didn't say, oh, by the way, Butler, General Butler, I'm going to send my chaplain over with your wife. Apparently this didn't happen. And it's not unusual. So you got to wonder, did Reverend Moore, was he just in sort of a bad position? He's a volunteer. He's a citizen soldier. He doesn't know the ways of the military. So he made a choice to follow his colonel. The general commanding didn't like it, and that was the end for Moore. Now, in 1868, I'm looking for information now to get some side of Reverend Moore's story. We get a little snippet. There's a letter that he wrote, which I haven't yet been able to find, but apparently he reported in the minutes of the General Conference of Maine, this is the congregational conference for the state. He reports, or I should say the minutes report, that that ship that he was on that was nearly wrecked off the coast of South Carolina on the way to New Orleans, he was returned to Portland on account of ill health, that's Portland, Maine, on account of ill health, and resigned the chaplaincy. So that's 1868. More or less for 30 years, that's the only published record I could find. Although, again, that letter, there might be some newspaper accounts, but until 1898, we get that story. Now, this doesn't affect Moore's patriotism. You still have in his 1865 Thanksgiving sermon, Reverend Moore talks about the war, and he says, the first blow of the war was struck in the interest of human bondage. He's suggesting some abolitionist beliefs or someone who came to understand the importance of universal equality. In the defense of the system and for its aggression, the flag of the free, as it was called and hailed the world over, went down at Sumter at the bidding, not so much of the defenders of slavery, for a system so well and amply defended hardly needed defenders, as of the proud, imperious, chivalric human bondage propagandists, the flag came down at the thunder of cannon of the enemies of liberty. So, he still is full of patriotism despite his challenges. Now, oddly, you don't really read a whole lot. There's not a lot about his life after the war, other than that sermon, until we get into the 1880s. By this time, he's left Maine. He went to Pennsylvania, where he was born for a while, winds up being in Cincinnati, Ohio. And in Cincinnati, he becomes editor of a Masonic publication. At that time, as he's editor, he gets caught up in a group that believes in the followings reportedly of this man, Joseph Surnow, who had a movement or a movement named for him that was sort of a rival group to the Masons, Surnowism. It actually was the thing up until the 1950s. So for the better part of a century, Surnowism was something that concerned the true Masons. So he's caught up in that. He writes an article or edits an article that somehow links him to Surnowism or raises suspicions about his connection, a possible connection to Surnowism. And he's in a spot where his career is once again on the line. And this time, the Masons, again, they follow, they find him guilty, they basically get rid of him. And he's no more. A few years later, he turns up. This news article, Demented Preacher. He's in a Cincinnati lunatic asylum. It's about 1901, I believe. And he dies that same year. So, a little photo sleuthing, a little research gives you a story of a man who was he wrongly accused? Was he following orders? Was he unsure of what he was supposed to do? Was his